A virtual mob goes after a mother for losing her cool at a Shoppers Drug Mart and demanding that store clerks speak English in Canada. The mainstream media decide that you cannot be a social conservative in Canada anymore, and some gadflies in the conservative movement want Andrew Scheer's head, so of course the mainstream media give them a huge platform. I'm Candice Malcolm, and welcome to another week in fake news. Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast. As promised, I am here in my new studio. It's all set up, so no more moving around and no more bad shots or no visuals for the podcast. So thanks for your patience throughout the election. And thanks everyone for continuing to support True North and follow our content. We had a really great couple of weeks there producing lots of exclusive news, and we had tons of support from our followers and from True North Nation throughout the whole saga of the lawsuit and the continued judicial review that we're fighting against the Trudeau government for our ability to be reporters in Canada. So appreciate that. Let's jump right into the news. So this is a story that, you know, if you go onto Twitter, they had these sort of top trending things. And for 2 full days, the top trending item was speak English in Canada. And it was all about this incident of a mother who was in a Shoppers Drug Mart. She definitely lost her cool. She started shouting at the store clerks and someone caught it on camera. The whole incident was described as racist. And, you know, there were stories written up in the mainstream media of this virtual mob that had been created going after this mother. And the mainstream media was like celebrating that as an example of like Canadian diversity and inclusion or something like that. Now, if you watch the actual video and you watch the footage, you can see 2 different things. For sure, this woman has lost her cool. She's angry, she's rude, she's shouting at these clerks, and you kind of feel sorry for the clerks because you see an angry person losing her cool and shouting at these individuals. But if you listen to what the mother is saying, she's accusing them of speaking Chinese right in front of her. So imagine if there's some kind of a dispute. I think the woman was trying to return some items and the store clerks were saying, no, you can't return it. And then right in front of her, they turn to each other and start speaking in a foreign language. You know, as a customer, you don't know whether they're talking badly about you, whether they're mocking you, whether they're making fun of you, or whether they're just trying to clarify something. So she lost her cool. We only saw the end part. So again, we don't know exactly what happened. But I think the really unfortunate thing, well, 2 unfortunate things. One, there's a virtual mobbing of this woman. And we see this all too often where, you know, the mainstream or the mainstream people on social media decide that someone has committed a sin and, you know, there's no time for explanation. There's no reasonable middle ground. The conclusion is just, you know, go for her head, dox her, ruin her life, find out who she is and, you know, make a big example of her. And there's no kind of middle ground. So, you know, we don't know. Obviously, this one was having a bad day. But the idea, too, that she was racist, that somehow in her tirade and in her rant against these employees, it was racist because she was saying, don't speak Chinese in front of me, speak English in Canada. I just reject that entire premise. I don't think that it's racist to tell someone to speak English. English is in English-speaking Canada anyway. It's what holds us all together. It's the glue of our society. So if you suddenly have newcomers that are coming in from all over the world and we're not asking them to speak English, we're just telling them to just carry on and do whatever you did in your former country. You don't have to become Canadian at all. You don't have to learn English. What is our society going to look like in 20, 30 years from now? We're going to have just a completely balkanized society. And so we should always encourage people to learn the language when they move here, to learn English. And that was sort of the takeaway for me, was that yes, this woman was in the wrong for being rude to these people, but no, she wasn't in the wrong for saying that they should speak English. We should all ask the newcomers speak English. And then, of course, the unfortunate thing is that the mainstream media picks it up as if it's this incident of racism, and then they echo the mob of the social media, you know, group that are demanding that this woman be shamed and whatever. No, we don't want to send the message to newcomers that English is optional. We want to send a message to newcomers that you should speak English. No, you shouldn't be rude. You shouldn't start getting into fights at the Shoppers Drug Mart. But I think we can all agree that we want newcomers to integrate, become Canadian, and part of integrating is learning English. Okay. Let's move on. This has been driving me crazy all week. It seems like every time I look at the news, everything in the news is focused around this movement to remove Conservative leader Andrew Scheer from his leadership position in the Conservative Party. You know, it's kind of interesting because when you look at the federal election results, sure, Justin Trudeau remains Prime Minister. the NDP are kind of in a good position because they hold the balance of power. But if you just look at the straight election results, the people who lost this election were the Liberal Party, who lost 29 seats, and they lost their majority status, and the NDP, who were decimated in Quebec. They once had almost 60 seats in Quebec, a huge block, just as recently as 2011. And they're now down to 1 seat in Quebec. They lost a total of 18 seats in this election. And they've really been wiped away. They're not even the third place party anymore. They're the fourth place party behind the bloc. So the two parties that really lost the election were the Liberals and the NDP. And yet, if you tune into the mainstream media and you watch the stories on the news, you would really think that Andrew Scheer just got absolutely wiped away, because all the stories are focused on how Andrew Scheer lost the election, and now all these voices saying that Andrew Scheer needs to be removed from party leadership. Well, I just want to, make the obvious case. I mean, look, I think that Andrew Scheer is a flawed person and that he ran a flawed campaign, but he picked up the most seats in the election. He gained 23 seats. He won more. He got more votes from more Canadians than any other party. He won the popular vote, and he removed Trudeau from his position as a majority government. So no, it wasn't an ideal election outcome, but it's hard to really say objectively, looking at the data, that Andrew Scheer lost the campaign. And yet every time you look at the news, you see tons and tons of examples of people going after Andrew Scheer. So let's go through a couple of these examples. I think that the first one that comes to mind was Patrick Brown, who's the former leader of the PC Ontario party, who had to resign in shame over a alleged personal sex scandal that he was involved in. And so, he's now the mayor of Brampton, but he shouldn't really be sitting giving some advice to Andrew Scheer, as someone who wasn't even able to maintain his own position as the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. But he had an op-ed in the Toronto Star, of all places, the most left-wing newspaper in Canada, where he goes after Scheer, and he basically just says that he failed to run a good campaign. He brought up a couple of examples, and one of the examples that Patrick Brown brought up was basically accusing Andrew Scheer of being Islamophobic, and it was over Scheer's opposition to M103, which is a motion that specifically condemned Islamophobia. That's nothing to do with anti-Muslim bigotry. Islamophobia is a word created by lobbyists that try to promote Islamicism in society. So the Liberals use this hyper-political word. They refuse to define it. To most people, when they think of Islamophobia, they think of, you're not allowed to criticize Islam, that somehow Islam is off topics for political debate. Patrick Brown kind of takes this distorted idea of what the M103 debate was about and uses the worst kind of bad faith interpretation of it to accuse someone in his own party of being Islamophobic. It's so tiring to hear that argument, but Patrick Brown was given a big platform. Here he is on CBC on Power and Politics making the same argument.
I was disappointed. I do a lot of work with the Muslim community in Brampton, and I couldn't explain why the Conservative Party would oppose a motion condemning hate against Muslim Canadians.
So again, he's just parroting the left. He's parroting liberal talking points, and he's making a bad faith argument against Andrew Scheer. He's not the only Conservative to do this. We had an individual by the name of Andrew Koch, Andrew Koch, I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name, but he created a campaign called Scheer Must Go, and that was all over the place being promoted. This is a young Conservative. I think he's probably in his early 20s, and somehow he's, being picked up by the media, and everyone's promoting this campaign that Scheer Must Go. Really, the guy has a very small following. There aren't really that many people engaging with his tweets and retweeting him, and yet, this was promoted on Twitter, this was a trending story on Twitter, and this was picked up by the mainstream media, this Scheer Must Go campaign. I think all of this to say is just that, there's a little bit of tension in the Conservative movement right now because Conservatives wanted to win the election. They wanted to form the government, and they didn't. And so the mainstream media is finding all these tensions and really just exaggerating it, I think, to kind of pull the Conservatives apart and to make the right more fractured. That's what they want. That's the goal here. Because if the media was being honest, they would be also looking at the NDP. I'm sure that there's voices in the NDP. I'm sure that they could find, 20-year-old NDP activists who want Jagmeet Singh removed. Or why not go after, even someone like Thomas Mulcair. Thomas Mulcair has written in the Toronto Sun that he disapproves of Jagmeet Singh and that he thinks he ran a bad campaign. But you don't see this, all over the place being promoted that, the NDP is at his throat and they're trying to remove him as leader. Not in the same way. The mainstream media are always going to go after conservatives in a way that they don't go after the other parties. And then speaking of that, as I'll just make this final point, Jagmeet Singh himself made the statement. He said it's pretty clear that you can't be a social conservative and become prime minister. The decision to have an abortion is between a person and their healthcare provider, and no one else has any business being involved in that. He's criticizing Shearer's views of gay rights as well. You cannot have Mr. Shearer's beliefs and be Prime Minister of Canada. It's pretty clear, said Jagmeet Singh. So again, Andrew Scheer is a Catholic. He has his own personal views, but then he's made it pretty clear that he's not going to legislate on those views, that he wants to kind of maintain the status quo on those divisive social issues. Really, these are battles that were fought like decades ago. Like, I don't know why these issues have been resurrected because no one's really talking about them other than the left and the media who are trying to run a scare campaign against conservatives. So apparently in Canada, you're deeply held personal views, even if you have no intention of acting or legislating on them, prevent you from being in public office. So what does that say to the millions of Canadians who are anti-abortion, who are pro-life, or who still have traditional, religious views when it comes to marriage and the definitions around that? Jagmeet Singh is basically saying that you can't be involved in public life in Canada, which is totally unfair and not true. Again, this is a free society, so if you want to get involved in politics and public life, your own personal religious views shouldn't stop you. And then speaking of that as well, Jagmeet Singh is clearly a religious guy. He's clearly a very devout religious person. He even wears a Sikh headscarf. So why aren't the media ever asking him questions about his personal views? Presumably he has some social conservative views as well. Otherwise he wouldn't walk around looking like an observant religious person. So I think that there's a double standard, and Jagmeet Singh himself is kind of emphasizing this by declaring that it's pretty clear you can't be a social conservative. I think he's wrong. This is part of the reason why his party, his leadership in the NDP has basically been decimated. Canadians have made it pretty clear that they're not interested in what the NDP is selling, and I think a lot of it does have to do with Jagmeet, but you don't really hear that very often in the media. They would way rather focus on the conservative and on the Catholic than get into making any religious criticisms about someone who is Sikh. So that's kind of the unfortunate state of the post-election analysis in Canada. I'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for listening, for watching, for tuning in. Don't forget to check out tnc.news for all the latest from True North. Thank you so much and have a great weekend.